Okay, let's get going again. Next up, we'd like to take a look at the whole issue of visual styles. And you may be noticing as we move around between these different views of the model, as I work, sometimes the views are in color, sometimes they're in black and white, sometimes you can sort of see through things. All of these different sort of characteristics of the views keep on changing, and let's give you some control over that so you can just really understand what the impact of each of these visual styles is and get just the views that you want, either to kind of work with as you go or to share with others. Okay, so the big thing to know about visual styles is that there are several predefined styles already set up for you within Revit. And where you find all those is here at the bottom of the drawing area. We have our little toolbar full of all our drawing area tools. And the second one over is the one that gives you all the visual styles. So you'll see there's 6 predefined styles, and then there's a graphic display options menu choice, which opens a dialog, which gives us a lot more control over what we can do. And let's start just talking through the different styles. Now, these styles will be available typically in any of the 3D views, the elevation views, the section views, the plan views. So it works the same in each of the different view types. The style that I tend not to work with very often in, but is probably the simplest to understand, is the wireframe view. And in the wireframe view, you're seeing no shading, you're seeing no solid fills, you're just seeing the outlines of all the objects, okay? And sometimes that's useful because you can see through things and select things. For example, I want to get that truss, I can grab that, but it's a little bit harder to select that wall panel. Okay, so I tend not to work in wireframe very often. I'll often turn that on just if I need to go through and see something that's hidden behind something else, but it's available. The more common view that we typically work with is called a hidden line view. In the hidden line view, the solids show up. Okay, so any solid surfaces are now there and hiding things, obscuring things that are behind them. So if, for example, we zoom on in here, you can sort of see there's a solid over here, okay? Behind it though, this is actually a piece of glass. That's why we're able to see through it. We can select things in the background through that piece of glass by tabbing, okay? But in general, if there's something that is solid, it doesn't have any transparency, it'll kind of obscure what's behind it, but objects can have transparency. Glass has transparency, that's why we're able to see through it. But the hidden line view creates, what I think of as a very standard way of looking at things. So I think, as we're drawing, you're often used to seeing things in these sort of hidden line views where things that are obscured will be hidden from you. So people tend to understand that very nicely. Next up, we have 2 interesting choices. It's 2 different variations on color. We have shaded and consistent colors. Let's see if we can kind of turn them on and see if you can spot the difference. Okay, this is a shaded view. Okay, showing the color of the materials. Okay, it's not showing necessarily a photographic pattern, but it's showing the color that's associated with the different materials. This is called consistent colors. So I'll go back again, shaded, come back over to consistent colors. Okay, and what you might notice about these 2 different options is that we're seeing the color information in both of the different views. That's the color information that's associated with the different materials of the objects. But what's happening in consistent colors is the color is consistently being displayed. This white panel over on the left is very similar to the one that's over here on the right. We're not seeing any effect of lighting and shadow and where the sun might be in the sky. But if I turn on shaded, you'll see there's a difference. So I can tell that the lighting is coming from the upper right-hand side. The left side is a little bit darker over there. Okay, so very, very similar, okay, but shaded is a little bit truer to what's going on, but that may be a little bit confusing to people about why it's the same white, but it looks like it's gray over here, and it's really just the lighting effects. So just kind of know the difference between those, because there's times you want to use each of them. Yeah, often shading gives people a little more dimensionality. They understand what's happening a little bit better because it's actually a little more realistic. Next up, we're going to look at this whole issue of realistic views. And realistic views, see if we can switch over to that, look a little bit different. Okay, let's talk about realistic views. Maybe one of the easiest spots to look at it is back over here when you look at that little wooden panel in the background. So if I go back to consistent colors are shaded. You'll see it's just a color. If I go to realistic, you'll see it actually looks more like a photographic pattern. And let me tell you why that is. Let's see if I can highlight that panel. We'll edit its type. And you see it's wood panel dark. Let's take a look at that material and how it's defined. Materials, we will learn as we start doing our rendering, have two different sorts of appearances associated with them. There's what's called the graphics appearance, and that's typically a color. It might also be a line pattern of some type. Okay, but that's what will show up in a shaded or in a consistent color view. Under the appearance tab for the material, we'll often have what's considered the photographic appearance for that. And this is sometimes generated programmatically. Sometimes we select photographs to go through and associate these, so images, but you'll get sort of a truer view of it. And it's meant to be something that has just a truer, more photographic appearance. Sometimes there's something called a bump map associated with it, which will give us a little bit of information for some shading. And these two are related together, or can be related together. See, here the appearance is. Here's the graphics appearance of it. We can relate the two together. For example, if you think about that image having a base color, if you took the average color for that entire image, you can use that by turning on this checkbox, use render appearance. Then the graphics appearance will be related to the color of the rendering appearance. You can make those separate too. I tend to leave them turned on related to each other because it makes it a little bit easier and less confusing as you're changing materials about what's going on. Okay, but long story short, if you roll back over to just choosing these things and get back out to the point where we're looking at things, if you turn on realistic appearance, you get a little more detail. Let me even kind of show you on this, just if you can see it. Can you see that the white appearance, even that has a little shimmeriness to it in the realistic, as opposed to in shaded or consistent colors, it's just flat white. Okay, so rendering realistic appearance gives you a little bit more realistic feel for things. It's part way towards rendering. Let me actually show you something one step further. That's another kind of impactful difference between those two. And that is if I go through and insert, let me load in a piece of entourage. We're just going to bring in a tree and show you what the effect of those, because there are some things as we're starting to do our rendering that are also affected. There's my Imperial Library. Oh, actually, entourage is under planting, or the trees are under planting. Entourage are people. I'll show you one of those too. Let me bring in some sort of nice tree. Okay, we looked at that a little bit earlier. Let me just place a tree. Okay, here's my little red ash tree. I'll put it right over here by the side of the building. Let me also load in one of those people, because this is again one of the differences you'll see. So let me grab one of the female people. I'll put her out here on the patio. I'm going to rotate her around by hitting the tab bar so she's facing forward. There she goes. Okay, let's go back to 3D. Got to remember which one it was. There it is. We'll zoom in here. So here we are in our shaded view, or our consistent color view. That's kind of okay. Notice everything, just kind of sketchy. It's really designed to be a little simpler, render a little quicker. So as you're working, think about kind of, just keeping things in these views. As you're presenting, you'll want to think about switching to the realistic view. Okay. You don't necessarily have to always be working in realistic. It slows your machine down a little bit. But if you turn on realistic, you'll see that the people actually start showing up. The tree looks a whole lot better. So that's one of the differences between that. Not a very good choice. We'll put Union out there instead. Okay, so that's one difference between the whole realistic versus shaded, is that some of these objects which have rich photorealistic content, they render nicer. They show you the detail in the realistic views, where they won't show you that in the shaded view. Okay, let me give you one last variation, one that I actually don't use very often, but it's halfway towards rendering, if I can sort of describe it that way. And that is called the ray trace view. Think of this as being a very quick dynamic render. So what it's going to try and do is use ray tracing to get realistic about the lighting, okay, and the effect of shadow. Okay, it's still not quite as high a quality as a true rendering, but it's getting closer. I'm just going to zoom on in there and see if you can spot the difference. So this is a view that's dynamic. It's going to keep on updating. The longer you let it kind of run, it'll kind of keep on getting a little bit better to higher resolution. But this will give you a preview of what's going to be happening as you do a rendering. Okay, you might notice here that the shadows are sort of interesting over here on this side with emollients. You see the shadow of this building being cast partially over kind of that area of the wooden panel. So ray tracing is giving you a lot finer information about how the shading is going to work. You can see the shadows of the mullions over here. So it's really starting to take into account, it's one step further. It not only gets the materiality, but it also gets the lighting and the shadow a little bit better. And I'll contrast that with just the shaded view. Notice in the shaded view, there's some information about the shading, but we're not getting the fine shadows. It's pretty much every surface has a degree of shading, but you're not getting the sub-shadows. So realistic, or we're going to learn, rendering views take that to the finest level. So if you go to realistic, you're sort of halfway there. It's kind of a preview where it's giving you the materiality, but not quite the shadow. Then finally, either by the ray trace view or by doing true rendering, you'll get to that final step. Okay, let me zoom on out and I will change this back over to like a hidden line view just to show you a couple of other interesting options that are available. Now, those settings are the defaults. They're all sort of readily put together, so they're easy to work with, but you can also customize all of the settings very easily. And there's something called graphic display options. It's the top choice in that menu that'll let you change these things. And you can change this kind of high level style of the view. But let's talk about some of the other things that are available in here. For example, to make this work, let me turn off the thin line, or cancel that. I have thin line view turned on right now. I'm going to turn that off so I can actually see the true line weights. Go back to those graphic display options because I want to show you something that'll involve line weights. Okay, there's the notion of silhouettes. Silhouettes is kind of a nice one. What'll happen here is you can choose some sort of a line type that you'd like to have appear at the outer edges. So, not very interesting there. Let me define a new line type. I'll say I'm going to do, my outside edges. And for that, I'm going to define, a very heavy line. People who do a lot of architectural drawing might know this technique. So I'll choose outside edges and apply that. You can see that really heavy line is now showing up around the outside. Now it's probably a little bit too heavy. So if I go back over to outside edges again, let me change that down to, more like 6 point. Try that. Might do a little experimentation to find what I like. Same match a little bit better. Okay, so you can definitely go through and add silhouettes. Again, if you do a lot of architectural drawing, you might recognize that as a technique we often use to help people understand where depth is added. We have the issue of shadows. There is what I'll call normal shadows. Okay, that's just the sunlight shadows. So we can see the sun's kind of up in the upper right-hand corner somewhere, and we have kind of the relatively harsh shadows. Okay. Very strong, dramatic. Let me turn on another feature called ambient shadows and see if you can spot the difference there. I'll turn that off again. And turn it back on. Let's take a look. With ambient shadows, you tend to get kind of a softer gray. What happens is light actually reflects off of all sorts of different surfaces. So if you want to take advantage of the light that's reflecting off of other surfaces in the model and how they would create, that would in turn would create shadows, you can turn on ambient shadows. It tends to create just a softer, more realistic kind of gray view as opposed to the just normal shadow view, which is kind of harsh. It's just black and white. Okay, so I tend to like ambient shadows. And there's just only ambient shadows. Here is only the harsh shadows. So put them in a combination if you like. Okay, another interesting choice that I think you may want to take advantage of, and if you are used to using SketchUp or other tools that have a sketchiness to them, I think this is kind of a nice one. I'll turn off the silhouettes for now. And turn on sketchy lines, because sketchy lines I think is kind of an interesting feature. Now, with sketchy lines, you have a notion of a certain amount of jitter. Let me show you what that looks like. That's a little sketchy. Let me kind of push it out further. That is sketchier. Finally, I can make that kind of very sketchy. Now let's talk about why that's useful. If you're early on in your design and you're sharing things with people and you're not really kind of hard line and you're thinking about the design, sometimes showing people things that look more like a napkin sketch is useful because it just sort of invites them to participate and think that the design is very fluid. They can still change things. They might pick up their pen or pencil and start drawing with you. Where when things are very hard line, often they'll get put off and say, hey, well, it's so fine right now. I don't really feel like I can change much. So sketchiness is sometimes, it's weird, implied or added to imply just less finished, the ability to kind of keep on changing things. So use it strategically. I actually like to turn on sketchy lines when I'm presenting designs very early on because it's just a little less intimidating to people who aren't familiar with doing the building modeling. Okay, another thing you could turn on that may be helpful to you, and again for our architectural drawing purists, is you can turn extensions onto lines. Oh, let me even turn off the jitteriness or make that not nearly as jittery so you can see that. So this is that thing. Oh, let me make them even higher. Where at the ends of where lines are drawn, there's a little bit of an extension to that. And again, it's just sort of for an architectural drawing perspective, kind of a nice feature. If you like that look of a hand-drawn drawing, often we put those little extension lines in there. Okay, one last one. There's some other ones in here, but the one I want to feature for you is the notion of a background. Currently, this is all just sitting on a white background. We could put on some sort of a sky. Okay, which actually changes the appearance pretty dramatically to have that standing off against the sky, or maybe even a gradient. Okay, or even a background image if you like. So a lot of choices in here. Let's see if I can find a nice background image. What do I got in there? Oh, choose a good background image for what you want. Is one of my messages here. Let's see if we can find one that actually looks good. I've got some very dramatic skies here. Oh, here's one. There's a fiery sunset. Let's turn on this one. Again, not that it's necessarily a great decision, but it'll illustrate it for you. We'll say, okay, and apply that. Okay, so you have just a lot of control over these drawings. Don't just assume they have to be boring, black and white, and kind of look very just standard. You can start customizing these to really create the effect you want, and you should use the styles because, well, it just adds a level of sophistication to your drawings and it'll really help you in just sharing your ideas and making people understand what your intent is. Okay, so practice a little bit with these visual styles and see if you can come up with some interesting effects for the views in your model.